Good morning, everyone. In our previous lessons, we saw people fight along the sunny shores of the Mediterranean Sea, where empire after empire rose and fell. We looked at the Persians, the Macedonians, the Romans, the Muslim Caliphate. Today, we completely change our scenery and we move to the frozen North Atlantic, where we will follow the adventures of the Norsemen as they challenge the storms of the Andes Ocean and reach lands that no one from Europe had visited before, almost. We will see how the Norsemen reached first Iceland and then Greenland and finally North America, asking ourselves, how do we know that they actually did it? How do we know that it actually happened? In particular, we're going to look at the following points. So, who were the Vikings? Just a bit of an introduction to the Norsemen. Who was Erik the Red and his discovery of Greenland and generally the discovery of Iceland by the Vikings? What happened? What was the story of Vinland and the Skraeling? Who were the mysterious Skraelings? And finally, we will talk about a few sources we have for the entire Viking colonization of North America. Today's question is: did the Vikings reach America, and how do we know? So let's start by first things first. Before we get into details on the Norse voyages, we need to describe in a few words who they were. So the Norsemen, or Vikings as they are known in modern English, possibly from an Old Norse word meaning raiders, were a group of people coming from the areas of Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden and Denmark, who in the 8th and 9th centuries AD began attacking and colonizing pretty much all the coastal regions of Atlantic Europe. Initially, they came as pirates and raiders, destroying monasteries and sacking villages, but later, with time, they began settling in those lands. For example, they founded Dublin in Ireland, they colonized the eastern coast of England, and they were particularly important for the history of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. They also contributed to the creation of Russia and traded with people who lived as far as the Umayyad Caliphate in the Middle East, and coins from pretty much all over the medieval world have been found in Viking graves. Now, one thing that helped the Vikings in their exploration of the oceans and in the construction of this huge trade network was their great ability as shipwrights and navigators. These skills allowed them to discover Iceland, a large volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, far away from anything remotely civilized at the time. In the previous centuries, only a handful of monks from Scotland or Ireland had been able to reach Iceland to begin with. By themselves, they did not bring crews or anything. They were just lonely people with small boats who made these incredibly difficult voyages from Scotland or Ireland to Iceland. And they were simply looking for the most isolated place they could find in order to pray without temptation. They were monks, after all. They were long gone, however, when the Vikings arrived, and despite the strangely alien landscape of the island, they settled there and called it the Land of Ice, Iceland. From there, they kept exploring the oceans and trying to find new lands to colonize and settle. Around 985 AD, an Icelander named Erik the Red led a group of 14 ships northwards, where he discovered the northernmost landmass in the world. He would call this land Greenland, despite the fact that it was frozen and hostile. According to some, but there is a very heated debate, it was because the name would encourage more people to move there. If they heard about Greenland, they would probably go there. But again, it's debated. Now, this is a map of the Viking travels through the North Atlantic. You can see here first the colonization of Iceland, then they moved on to Greenland, and finally to North America. The son of Erik the Red, the guy who had discovered Greenland, Leif Erikson, had settled in Greenland, but there was a problem. Not enough trees grew in the new land, and this meant that they had troubles finding materials to repair the ships, to build new houses, and to do all the things that you need timber for. This meant, again, that they needed to find these resources. They had heard the stories that a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, Bjarni had sighted a land far to the west with abundant forests and without any human settlement, or so he believed. Based on his information, around the year 1000, Leif Erikson took a ship and 35 of his mates and sailed to the west. Eventually, they ran into a land which looked fertile, covered with forests and full of wild grapes, from which wine could be made. They called this land Vinland, the land of grapes, and it might correspond to the local island of Newfoundland, which is now in modern Canada. This makes Bjarni and Leif Erikson the first Europeans to set foot in America. However, they were not the first humans. Indeed, the Inuits and the Algonquians and other Native American peoples had lived there for millennia and were probably a bit confused when they saw the Norsemen stepping out from the big boats. We don't really know what they thought, since they left us no sources on the matter, but we know that the Vikings called them Skraeling, which means those who wear animal skins. It's a debated etymology, but might be the most fascinating one. Leif Erikson went back to Greenland with a load of timber and grapes, and this ignited the interest of other potential explorers. They all wanted to go to this new land. Eventually, 4 expeditions would reach Vinland, but the settlement would not last for long. While the Vikings initially traded with the Skraeling, they soon started fighting for a more or less unknown reason. The constant fighting with the natives and the distance between Vinland and Greenland, which is about 3,500 kilometers, made it impossible to keep the colony running. And also Greenland was very scarcely populated to begin with. Only about 500 Norsemen and women lived in Greenland, making it impossible to support the American colony from there. Eventually it was abandoned and it was forgotten for centuries. That is, until historians came across a few interesting sources from the Middle Ages. Now, we've got 3 main sources that tell us about the Viking settlement in Greenland. A short passage from a medieval German chronicle, 2 Icelandic sagas, and archaeological evidence. The oldest source we have got for the Viking settlement in North America is the chronicle written by Adam of Bremen, who wrote about the history of the German city of Hamburg. He wrote that during a visit to the city, the King of Denmark described the many islands discovered by the Norse people in the Atlantic Ocean. He mentioned Greenland, Iceland, and then Adam wrote this. Moreover, the King of Denmark also reported one island discovered by many in that ocean, which is called Vinland, for the reasons that grapevines grow there by themselves, producing the best wine. That's all. Okay? On the one hand, this source is the oldest mention we have of Vinland, and the one that is closest to the actual period of history when this was supposed to happen, having been written around 1075 AD. On the other hand, this source could refer to really any other island in the ocean, and we know all too well that people in the Middle Ages were very imaginative when it came to the geography of unknown lands, often making up entire continents and kingdoms. So there might be a connection, but by itself this source is not enough. Then we have the sagas. Sagas are like epic poems written about Viking heroes, to put it very shortly. The sagas are a fantastic source, full of exciting stories and details. They tell us how many people went there, what they did, what they said, and how they died. They tell us, for example, that a Viking named Thorvald started a fight with the Skraeling, killed 9 of them, and then when his boat was surrounded by hundreds of Skraeling who were riding hide canoes, he was shot by an arrow and died. However, there are some problems. First of all, the sagas were written about 200 years after the arrival of Leif Erikson in Vinland, and they were based on word of mouth. It was oral tradition. People were talking about this, and you know how it is. Oral tradition tends to deform events. It's like a game of Chinese whisper. They are also work of essentially fiction, okay, which revolve around heroic actions performed by heroic characters, more or less like historical films that might have been a kernel of truth, but it's very difficult to identify. We cannot use them to understand what actually happened, no more than we can use, for example, 300, the film 300, to understand ancient Greece. It is based on real event, but they are deformed beyond recognition, okay? Or no more than we can use a 007 movie to understand the Cold War and spying during the Cold War. Finally, we have got the smoking gun of all sorts of evidence, archaeological evidence. Excavations made in Canada at a place called Lansomedo, which you see in a modern reconstruction here, have recovered a small but fundamental thing, which is iron nails. Now, granted, the iron nails are not as flashy as axes or shipwrecks or helmet or big churches or whatever, but they're still incredibly important. Why? First of all, carbon dating of the nails shows that they were produced around the 11th century, and we know that they were made by Norsemen because, first, they match the kind of nails that they used to repair the ships, and second, because the Native Americans did not know about iron back then. So, these discoveries made it very clear that there must have been some kind of Viking settlement in North America around the 11th century. But unfortunately, nails don't talk. They don't tell us what happened, or why, or what the Skraeling taught, or how many Vikings were there, what they wanted, and where they thought they were. Okay, unless we find another Viking settlement in the area, which they are looking for, those are things that we will probably never know. So, what do you think is the most reliable of the sources, is the most important of the sources to understand and confirm the arrival of the Vikings in America? I'm looking forward to read what you can write, and, well, see you next time.